In C#6, a new technique was added to allow you to filter exceptions based on some Boolean expression prior to executing a specific catch block. To understand how this works, let's first create a traditional try catch block. And here we will do console write line error. Let's make this string interpolation. ex.message. Then let's do an example where we're going to force a divide by 0 exception to occur. Z will be equal to x divided by y. So we know this command, because y is 0, is going to trigger an exception and make the code fall into this catch block. Let's make sure the app doesn't close prematurely. We'll run the code, and you can see error attempted to divide by 0. Now, with exception filtering, we have the ability to add a when clause after a specific catch statement to indicate we only want to run this catch block when a certain criteria has been met. So we could put anything we want in here, like we could just say when true. The compiler is going to complain and say, well, if you just want to say when true, then there's no need for a filter. But you can have any Boolean expression in here. It can be a function call that returns a bool. It could be a test to see whether x is equal to 10 or not. When we run this, it'll still execute the same because x is 10. But if I said, well, only when x is 5 do we run this, now we get an unhandled exception because x isn't 5, and therefore, since this was the only catch block, we now no longer have an appropriate handler for this exception. So to fix that issue with the unhandled exception, we can then have another catch with exception EX, but since this one doesn't have a filter, it will again act like the catch-all. So we could indicate that this is number 1 error and this is number 2. When we run this, you will see it now drops into the number 2. It is important to note that this when test occurs before anything within the catch block. So this could simplify your exception handling if you have multiple conditions that you need to test. If you're going to have to put an if statement inside of the catch block anyway, it might be simpler to express it as a series of when clauses at the end of your catch statement. Let's look at a more complex example. Let's assume the user has to input 2 values. We'll call them input 1 and input 2. Then we are going to convert these into int values. We'll call int 1 and int 2. And from here, we would say console.write enter number 1. Input 1 is equal to console.readline. And then we would attempt to parse. Int 1 is equal to int.parse input 1. And we would repeat this for the second number. So I'll change all the 1s to 2s. I'm going to give the ints some default values, and I'll show you why here in just a minute. Then we'll put this block of code within a try. And now we would normally just output the error message as such. The problem here is we don't know if and when an error occurs, did it happen for the first block or the second block of inputs. All we know is there was an error. So if we needed to have a special handler to indicate, okay, if it's the first block of inputs, we deal with it this way. If it's the second block, we deal with it another way. We would have to possibly put an if statement in here to say, if int1 is still min value, that means we didn't correctly input int1 maybe. Or if int1 wasn't min value, that means we failed on int2. So what I can do is put a when clause at the end of this catch and say when int1 equals int.min value, that means error parsing number 1. Otherwise, if it's not a problem where int is no longer, if int is not min value, that means we had issues parsing number 2. Let's go ahead and run this. And if we enter 1 is fine, and then we put an A for number 2, we know there's an error parsing number 2 because we did enter a legal value for 1 and it is no longer int min value. If I run it again and type A for number 1, now we know that there's an error parsing number 1 because it was never changed from int.min value. But we can also use this technique to combine multiple exception types into a single catch block. So if we were to have another try block here with another catch exception EX, and this time when we perform the code, let's force a divide by 0 exception, but we could also still have invalid input. So I'll reset int1 to int.min value to put it back to the original condition. And then I will do the same with int2. I'll perform the same inputs. And then at the end, I will have to create another int called int3. And I'll set int3 is equal to int1 divided by int2. So now we know we might get an exception based on the fact that it's not an int. So if we read in a value and it's a, that would cause int.parse to fail. And the same could happen for number 2. But if we get all the way here, but int2 is a 0, then we know we get a divide by 0 exception. So I will put a new error output here. And then I'm going to create a filter to determine if the exception type is either a format exception or it is a divide by zero exception, and we'll handle them together in the same block. Then I could create a catch-all down here. And just so we can distinguish them, I'll put a number 1 here and then a number 2. Then when we get to this code, we'll be asked to enter a number 1 and a number 2 again. If we put 10 and A, we get the number 1 error. Input string was not in a correct format, so that's a format exception. We do it again with a 0 for number 2, and we get the attempted to divide by 0 exception. So as you can see then, if we have a common catch for multiple exception types, this is one of the easiest ways to do it. Again, you could probably put an if statement inside of the catch. The downside is you would then have to handle all of your exception types within that single catch handler. You couldn't have multiple catch handlers then. Because if your if statements failed, you wouldn't be able to trigger another catch block. So you'd have to fall into this specific catch and then deal with all the possible eventualities within that single catch. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that approach. However, this can be a far simpler and more customizable approach in the long run.